So this panel will be moderated by someone other than myself. That is John Havens, who is Executive Director of one of the IEEE projects. And I will actually turn it over to John now to introduce the panelists or have them introduce themselves, or however John wants to proceed with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth. Can you hear me and see me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Seth, for the opportunity to join. And really excited to be moderating a panel today on data, bias, and ethics. And what we'll do is start off with brief introductions from all of our speakers. And I'll start briefly again. I work with the IEEE. It's the world's largest technology professional association. And I'm part of the IEEE Standards Association, which you may know, like the Wi-Fi standard was created by IEEE. I lead a large program focused on artificial intelligence and ethics at IEEE. We created a document called Ethically Aligned Design with about 700 global experts over the last 3 years. That also inspired about 13 standards working groups. And in fact, it was just last Friday, the first standard in that family of standards launched. So I can talk more about that if we have time. What else? I'm an author of a book called Artificial Intelligence, and I've done a lot of work on personal data. And so that's why I'm also excited to be here today. So let's go to our other panelists. And Sarah, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you, John. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Sara Jordan, and I presently work for the Future of Privacy Forum. I'm also an affiliate faculty with Virginia Tech. While my primary charge with Future Privacy Forum is to discuss AI and ethics, I've also got experiences in natural language processing, natural language understanding, particularly interested in how we use very short text snippets to try to create better models for natural language generation. So with that, I'll give it back over to John, with whom I've worked now for about 5 years on a number of other IEEE things, including, for those of you who are also interested in words and getting technologists and engineers to speak the same language, part of the IEEE Glossary Committee, which is a strange document that tries to look at how people from philosophers to engineers to computer scientists to mathematicians use the same words in many, many different ways. So thanks, John.
Sure, and it's a strange and yet fantastic document, thanks to you. So thank you, Sarah, so much. Anusha, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. My name is Anusha Dandapani.
Anusha, we lost you. We heard you for a second.
Okay.
Then we lost you. Oh, now I hear you. Great. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Anusha Dandapani. I lead the data science team for surveillance at Barclays. And I'm also an adjunct faculty at NYU. I teach visual analytics. And I'm also a big proponent of bias and AI and gender equality in AI and ML-based implementations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. All right, Ariadne, how are you?
Good. So my name is Ariadne. I'm the Director of Product Management at AlgoFace, where we are on a mission to build the most accurate, unbiased face AI in the world, with a special focus on the beauty industry and building augmented reality for the beauty industry. I am also a holder of an AI beauty technology patent, and I'm proud to say that I'm one of the 4% of US AI patent holders who are women. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I know, sorry, I already messed it up. It's Ariadne, so my
yes.
bad.
No worries.
And second of all, you have the AR makeup testing tool, right?
Yes, correctly. Correct.
Yeah.
Which Talib just spoke about briefly in his talk.
Yeah, I just used that. It was great. I put on lipstick.
Oh yeah.
And
Did you find your
thought
color?
it looked fantastic. I did. I thought
I'm
it
sure
looked really
you did.
good. Yeah, no, thank you. It was really fun. And also I want to say thanks to Seth, because it's really fun to be on kind of a reverse gender panel where I'm the only guy. Seriously, I hate being on manels. So it's really exciting to have the real brain power on this panel be all of you. All right, so Seth sent on a good question that we wanted to make sure to cover. I'll make the first question. And for our panelists, certainly if someone wants to speak first, awesome. But then someone else just go ahead and speak next. We can make this very conversational versus, one person speaks and the next person speaks. So Seth sent me on to an interesting article. Apparently there was a research team led by Dublin City University, and they looked at 8 out-of-the-box automatic classifiers for facial affect recognition. And again, Seth had pointed out, of course, throughout the day, there's been all these wonderful speakers talking about general effective computing definitions, et cetera. So I assume that the audience, we don't have to cover some of those basics. But anyway, in this article, what they were doing was comparing these sort of out-of-the-box automatic classifiers from different AI effective computing technologies with humans in terms of comparing sort of the 6 basic emotions that a lot of these systems can read versus blended emotions. And quoting from the article, one of the people who created the study said, for these systems, human emotions come down to only 6 basic emotions, but they don't cope well with blended emotions. And don't worry, I'm getting to the question. I just wanted to give background. The other quote said that companies using such systems need to be aware that the results obtained are not a measure of the emotion felt, but merely a measure of how much one's face matches with a face supposed to correspond to one of those 6 emotions. So here we're really speaking about accuracy, right? And are the underlying models and assumptions sound from a lot of these systems? So I'm going to make that the first question, open to anybody. I hope that question made sense, but do you agree with that study? And do you think these models are sound? Wide open. And I'll pick on someone if no one wants to call. How about you, Ariadne, now that I can say your name correctly? Is that a fair question? I'm just throwing it out there, but since you're also creating the technology, the AR would be helpful to hear.
Definitely. So it's hard to say without having like a real look at the study. This is the first time I'm hearing about that particular study. But I think there are a variety of things that we have to consider. And the most important thing is those models of the people who are showing these like 6 basic emotions that, the other people's emotions are supposed to match up to, who are they, and are they representative of, the general population? We are on track to have majority non-white, according to the US Census, majority non-white people in the US by 2045. 50% of the US is women. And unfortunately, a lot of researchers forget about these facts. They use, white men as kind of the go-to for these models. So if those are the people who are the models for this technology, it's likely that we have people who are women or who aren't white, who don't necessarily match up and aren't necessarily accurate because of this biased AI.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so that's just something to think about.
Sarah, I'm going to pick on you. Any thoughts to that? And I'll just ask everyone at this point.
Great. So I'll jump in here on a couple of points. So one, it's not just the emotion that's on someone's face, but how the people who labeled the data, how they're sourced. So do we have accurate representation or full demographic representation for people who are charged with labeling the data? But then also, are the images, as Ariadne pointed out, are they also representative? So I think we need to think about that on two valences. It really is the AI workforce itself, and that includes everyone from people who are in sort of labeling type of boxes or classification type of missions, all the way to people who are to building the algorithms. from my own experience working with a number of students in a master's program on a project that's very similar to this, we were looking at how it is that we can classify whether or not children are smiling in an image on Facebook. And what we were trying to do is see whether or not a smile actually drove user engagement, so likes, comments, etc., just on 2 different organizations' platforms. What I found when using this group of very diverse master's students of, I believe there's 12 students who were involved, we couldn't even agree whether or not a child was smiling. And a smile is pretty easy, right? All of us have some version of a smile on our face now. Seth's photo that's up there now is also a smile, but whether or not you can get even just 12 people to agree on a smile, already difficult. Then translating that into an algorithm and then putting that into very large scale development is obviously going to be something of an issue. So we may need to think about the workforce as well here.
No, it's a great point. And also, I didn't mean to throw any of you guys in terms of like, hey, here's an article you haven't read, but more in the sense of like, and I'm also articles where it's sort of like AI does this better than humans, or those either or things I don't think are the most effective kind of framing. Because also what I think is fascinating, being a fan of like Paul Ekman and micro expressions and being very general, but obviously a lot of AI can much better recognize the fleeting micro expressions that humans can't recognize in each other. So I think it's the blended opportunity with humans working with the technology that seems like a really positive benefit. But that said, Anusha, did you have any comments on this question before I move on?
Yes, definitely. One thing that we all are very cautious about, especially in financial services, where most of our decisions are based on the risk, the underlying risk that the decision comes out with, right? The learning algorithms have no way of distinguishing between a pattern and wizard knowledge, because it's absolutely driven by the sort of the approach that you take in the learning algorithms. But there are 4 or 5 ways where usually when you do classify certain things, a bias gets introduced in your data, right? Like, you know, there's bias in the data set that is used to train your model. There is also sort of an association-based bias. Like, for example, there is a protected class. Say, for example, if you're a minority community and you have a specific characteristics associated with minority community, and you always sort of tag those associated variables with those community, it kind of drives the learning algorithm to learn the pattern differently, isn't it? And then also the second is this interaction bias, like how Sara just mentioned. There is other ways where you will introduce the human in the loop can introduce another bias, which is based on, because 12 people cannot agree on one sort of a target variable, there will always be the human in the loop sort of an interaction bias that will get introduced into this learning algorithm. That is something that we should always be cautious of. And then also group attribution bias. So that is like, you know, too much generalization. What that means is not just being representative sample, but you should also be quite cautious. There is a fine balance between how representative sample is being chosen as to how do you generalize a special case, and is it in comparison to the entire class? Is it a balanced sample of information that you're feeding into this model? Those things needs to be sort of paid attention to when it comes to learning models.
Wonderful, thank you. By the way, Anusha, I have a Zoom background bias, which is, I think you have the best background. No offense to the other panelists. It's very handsome. I had to like move like a bunch of suits hanging up behind me. That's like part of the COVID thing. People don't explain to you as much about is how do you dress your office to look good.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you. So let me see, I want to go back to our questions that we had discussed. Let me ask you this, because Anusha, I did want to ask you about a case study, but since that you mentioned on our rehearsal, which was really helpful in terms of bias. But before we get back to you, what are some of the top issues that each of you see of concern. We're going to end the panel with the very positive things. So my goal here is not to pick on the technology, but more to say, as experts in this space, you know, what are some of the things? And by the way, those could be concerns about how people are framing the technology in a negative way. So Ariadne, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I think there are a number of concerns. I think at a consumer level, people are getting really weary, and reasonably so, with these facial recognition companies that are misusing people's privacy and misusing their data. For instance, you know, there was that case where Amazon's recognition was used on a number of lawmakers, and they labeled a number of them as criminals rather than lawmakers. And the majority of those people were minority groups. So with information like that out there, people are generally worried about their safety and how facial recognition could be affecting their livelihood, whether or not they could be considered a criminal or not. And I think this does come back down to just like bad data, garbage in, garbage out, and using, you know, data sets that are misrepresentative of a community. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to fix that. And then also on a little bit, like on a less serious note, there are also, you know, fun things that people try to do, like Snapchat filters, where you can like put on bunny ears or like fun eye looks or whatever. Those don't always recognize people with darker skin tones in certain lighting conditions. And that's affecting, you know, teenagers who are just trying to have fun. So there's a lot of different areas where, you know, better data labeling and better data sampling could be, you know, vastly improving the technology.
Awesome, thank you. And but by the way, since you have the AR makeup thing, this is in my head, but like you've like the best combination of earrings and earbuds I have seen yet in a Zoom call. Like it was like, where is your headset?
It's my new look.
Yeah. No, it's actually like a good fashion thing. What I'll do is I'll go to Sara to answer the same question. And then Anusha, I really want to dig into the case study you had in a moment because it was really helpful. But Sara, thoughts about concerns that you have from a future privacy forum or just in general?
Sure. So one of the things that I would say is the biggest concern has been brought up by both Ariadne and Anusha, and that's really balance in training data. So how do we make sure that any type of biometric system we are building, whether from facial recognition to even cough detectors, thinking of the COVID pandemic, really does have adequate representation across age spectrum, across gender. Obviously for facial recognition, race is important here, but thinking about disability also. So when we're speaking about facial recognition, the way in which disability manifests itself in terms of facial comportment also needs to be considered here. So making sure all protected classes are considered. And we do strive conscientiously to create balance in training data. Now that may mean that we need to add more AI, not less, which could mean we try to use more simulated data, more synthetic data, more composite data in order to be able to address some of the sampling problems that we may have had in the past that just arise from the natural way in which many of our data sets are gathered or sampled. Other things I would say is particularly thinking about privacy. Our emotions are a reflection of our thoughts and our internal states. So when we're trying to recognize someone's emotion, we are really trying to read their mind, or at least read their mind in terms of how it appears on their face. Is that really a direction that we want to go? Thinking about it from the perspective of, say, a model inversion attack. If we're trying to determine whether or not we want to create a anger detection mechanism, right? How angry is angry? We know whether or not we're, waiting on the subway platform and the train is 2 minutes late angry versus 2 hours late angry. That's some fine subtle grades there. But that's simply our thought. If someone were to engage in a model inversion attack on something like that, you may find yourself having been pointed out by someone as being overly angry. Do we necessarily want to go that particular route? securitizing our models, treating those as assets to be secured, not just the data to be secured, I think is really important. Or even thinking about ways to use sort of privacy preserving techniques in the ways that we train these models. So whether or not that's through federated learning, improvement of different types of encryption techniques, all of those things I think are very important for developers to start to address as they really think about emotion detection. And finally, just how do we put a confidence interval around whatever type of recommendation an instrument gives us? How do we know that someone is 2 minutes late subway angry versus 2 hours late subway angry in terms of what the model spits back out to us? Obviously, right now, many of us are concerned about finding very accurate descriptions of people's internal states or their external emotions as we try to address reopening the economies, etc. But figuring out what the proper way to set a bounding box on our recommendations will be seems to be a real big issue right now, and should be a big issue for emotion recognition in general.
Awesome, thank you. Anger management. I hate anger management. I hate that stuff. I'm in suburban New Jersey, and apparently, speaking of anger management, lawnmowers and leaf blowers are essential jobs. So, you know, I'm happy people have the work, but there are times that the sound makes me angry. But, you know, detection along the lines of what you said, Sarah, would be a great thing. Quickly though, I do know how important that is and the balance of the opportunity versus the challenges, Sarah. Like I know with listening devices in the home, and I won't mention manufacturer names just because I don't want to bias people in terms of what a company did, but you know, hearing anger in a voice, you know, a lot of times for me, I think facial recognition with regards to effective computing, but certainly vocal tension as it's recognized in a human voice can be pretty common globally, at least from my research, in terms of anger expressed in this way can be the same in multiple languages. And the opportunity, for instance, in someone's home, in COVID, unfortunately, this has been, you know, increasing things like domestic abuse, recognizing anger in someone's voice. When would there be a potential time that, for instance, you'd want to get a child out of a tough situation? So, but the privacy thing is critically important. So I'm not offering a solution here, just that like, what a great opportunity to continue to discuss with experts like you, how to bring this technology, you know, forward in ways that are clearly disclosed and all that stuff. Anyway, thank you, Sarah. So as I said, Anusha, I want to get to you. You had a great case study about issues with bias in training models when we did our rehearsal. Would you mind giving some background to that and then talking about that?
Sure. Bias in AI happens. It's not that we are not going to run away from it, right? Like, but when what is the cost of bias is when these machine learning models, when they generate unfair results, which are like, you know, due to erroneous machine learning algorithms, right? Like that's where the trust in this AI-based sort of solutions kind of like, you know, brings a question mark. Like, you know, for example, there was a survey conducted by Capgemini where 34% of those consumers stated that they would stop interacting with the company if the interactions with their commercial AI system happens to be like, you know, perceived to be unethical. Like, you know, they are clearly discriminating people or they're classifying people erroneously and things like that. That kind of brings this mistrust, but there are ways to sort of mitigate it, right? Like one classic example is when Apple Card launched its credit card, they were accused of gender bias in how they were sort of establishing a credit limit for the candidates who are applying for an Apple credit card. And because they didn't have this sort of misspecification in their algorithm or like, you know, incomplete data in their training of their model algorithm, the algorithm never took women in consideration as to how the credit limit needs to be aligned to, especially for a profile based on the demographic groups of individuals that they have trained the model with. right? Like, so that kind of drives into so many things. So why we should care about these bias? Because one top 10 reasons why we should care about, especially in financial services, is because this can create unwanted sociological bias also, right? Like, for example, if you are going to determine your credit risk based on your recent past and sort of the social bias that is fed into these models to determine your credit risk kind of could emerge into a reasoning concern for somebody to be aware of, right? So what are the things that we should identify is something like definitely regulatory compliance. If you're in a regulated space, you need to be sort of working only with explainable and interpretable approaches or models. And second is about security, which Sara pointed about the adversarial attacks or sort of the attacks that can come about in sort of backtracking your model. And also why you should care about things like this is because it will bring you reputational damage to the company, right? Like, and it can kind of bring you two types of losses, definitely beyond financial losses, also the reputational risk of how your company is perceived and the trust around how your results of your algorithm looks like determines how the general public will be sort of responding to your algorithms. And so there are ways to mitigate it. We can measure these biases. You have to go back to the source of the bias. The source of the bias always starts from like sort of an ill-defined target variable. If you define your target variable with sort of like, very few specificities, that can lead to trouble. And when you use proxies to sort of train your model, like, for example, you're keeping in track of number of arrests or number of court cases that this particular person had, or this particular race specifically has from this particular region or a zip code they usually come out with, these profiles are all tagged differently. Those sort of like, proxies needs to be re-looked at, has to be measured appropriately. And also there is something called as a capture bias, especially when it comes to image-based sort of recognition that you build, like for example, race, or like, the photograph is sort of tilted and like the photograph background color was not very effective, or the object that they focused on was very specific to an Apple product which was in the picture, or things like that. Most Apple product consumers are not necessarily Black. So those kind of hypotheses and sort of conclusions that the algorithms can make can be detrimental to this organization, right? And then also another one is the selection bias. What sort of what do you call it, the data set that you're selecting to train a model will determine the accuracy of how your model is a representative sample of your data set, right? Like, and also another is that unfair sampling and labeling the data differently and not thoroughly sort of re-evaluating the types of errors that can go about in labeling your data. Those are the things that we should measure from the source of bias perspective to mitigate this sort of risks. That is something that we do care for, because also beyond all this, this has to become a policy. This has to become a best practice. This has to become the framework that AI, ML based sort of entities need to consider. We all have to work together to consider that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It was fantastic. And I'm also amazed how fast the time has already gone, because I think we're going till 3:50. And I did want to say we actually have a question. So thank you to Cheryl. And Sarah, I'm going to throw this to you, or Ariadne, and I'll read it to you. Cheryl said, let's see, I was wondering if anyone or IRBs or ethics boards has tried providing some guidance for how someone interacting with a bot should behave. Here I'm thinking of web forms where banks or insurance companies provide instruction to avoid including PII in the web form request. And then she said, please avoid using sarcasm or humor, or please state your question or request in as clear and plain language as possible. It seems like sarcasm and humor could confuse a machine much like it often confuses Sheldon Cooper. Anyway, Cheryl, that was a great question. And Sara, Ariadne, do you just give me one of these if you want to answer quick, because we're going to wind up pretty soon. Yeah, Sara,
Sure.
and then Ariadne, I'm going to go to you next.
Thank you, Cheryl. So briefly, I don't think that anyone has actually tried to give systematic guidance for how to insert language to remind users how not to include private information in the context of chatbot use. However, in a very recent survey of the 50 states and 25 biggest cities in the United States, how they're deploying chatbots for COVID and also for unemployment assistance. I've actually found a number of states do simply state, please do not insert personal information in this conversation. In testing that and inserting things that look like birth dates or inserting things that look like social security numbers, I've not been kicked out of any of those bots. That seems like a great place for people to do some work, but maybe Ariadne, you guys have already started addressing this?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of, any guidelines for consumers on how they should be acting when interacting with the chatbot. But with our company, we have basically all of our technologies run on the edge. So what AI on the edge means is that it functions either in browser or on device, even on low internet connection. So it's not pinging back and forth to any servers. What this does is that it allows, we are B2B, so it does allow the businesses we work with to remain GDPR and California Privacy Act compliant, and it makes collection of data optional. So it does, it is more protective of consumer rights, but I'm unsure what other guidelines other companies are following. I really hope that more AI companies start working in that way.
There are specific guidelines that are given to us by FINRA, especially the regulators, when we are deploying algorithms or learning algorithms where there is a decision that's being made, and if there is a risk associated with the decision of the algorithm, there are two specific regulations that has come about. Definitely in the UK and in Europe, the GDPR also has a code of conduct of how AI-based implementation should look like. Here, there is Ethical Institute here in the US that's been put together. A group of sort of AI ML practitioners have come together to come up with a framework and agree on the guidelines. There are many agencies that are focused on ethical AI and ML. They're all propping up, but the White House have taken notice of it. In January 2020, they have come up with guidelines, especially for financial services, that has been given to us already, but these are all not sort of widely implemented frameworks yet, but there is a definite room for improvement in this space, looks like.
Very cool. And I watch far too much dystopian science fiction, but Westworld, the opening episode of the most recent season, had a guy getting a phone call where he was getting told that his job application wasn't accepted. And about a minute into him saying like, well, can you double check? Because he was really hard up for a job. He paused and the actor did a good job. And he goes, I'm sorry, is this an AI? And I thought it was interesting because how much science fiction sort of trains us for what might come in terms of our behavior. But as a wrap-up question, because I want to honor the time, we have 7 minutes left. Moving from dystopian to utopian, want to see if each of you could give like a 1 to 2 minute summation, because we're actually going to wrap up in 7 minutes. 5 years from now, give a best case scenario where effective computing, emotion AI, does the best that it can for humankind. What does that look like? And then any other final words you want to let people know, maybe where they can find out more about what you're doing online. And we'll just go down the line. So we'll start this time from Ariadne, if you can go first.
Definitely. So I think the goal is for AI technologies to be working for all people, especially, you know, as it starts to become more prevalent in everything we use day to day. We as a team believe that the limit to diversity does not exist. So this definitely, you know, is true both behind the screen and in the technology. Without a diverse team supporting the technology, it's really hard to have a technology that's going to be working for everybody. You know, Talib mentioned in his presentation, our team is 63% women, and we do have people from 8 different countries, and I think that does contribute to a lot of our success. Something else I will say is the use of test user communities. We have a really broad and diverse test community of people of a variety of backgrounds, ages, genders, different abilities, and beyond, so that really supports us in determining whether or not we have any, you know, blind spots. So I think, you know, making sure more AI companies work on diversity behind the screen and in their technology.
Awesome, so much. Thank you so much. And since I think we are wrapping up, really appreciate Ariadne, you joining. Do you just want to give people, I know that we've already heard from one of your colleagues, do you want to give any URLs or something where people can find out more about you and your work?
Oh, definitely. So our website is algoface.ai, and there's a link there to request an SDK if anybody is interested.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Anusha, 5 years from now, the world's your oyster. Be aspirational. What's the best scenario you can think of, or one of them, for how emotion AI or effective computing could work?
Yeah, in my vision, the way I see AI evolve is like there is this misconception that AI will replace sort of the jobs, when that is not true. It's not going to replace most of our jobs unless they are operationally efficient. But what I envision is AI-powered employees in future, where every aspect of what we do will be augmented by AI and sort of the improved way of doing things, and where machine learning and effective computing will support our daily and day-to-day processes. It doesn't matter which industry that you would work with. That is my positive vision for AI. And I can be reached via LinkedIn. Look me up. I'm sort of a big advocate of women and women in data science, and I lead many initiatives around identifying and mitigating gender bias, and how can we bring equality in data. Reach me via LinkedIn, message me.
Awesome, thank you, Anusha. Also, Zoom backgrounds. You have deep expertise, Zoom backgrounds. Not a minor thing these days. My dear friend Sara, you'll wrap us up for panelists before I say one last quick word, but what do you think 5 years from now?
Sure. So thinking about sort of the technical side of it, it would be really amazing if we improved our ability to match sentiment analysis and emotion in AI, to be able to figure out how to take images of people and to verbalize the visual, thinking about the ways in which that could help sort of the low-sighted community to be able to participate in things like beauty, those topics that obviously AlgoFace addresses quite specifically. I think that will be a major insight for all of us. But I think the most 5 years from now, I think what would be best is if AI was to be able to manage those complex emotions, to not only be able to make humans more emotionally intelligent and emotionally sensitive, but also to be an augmenting partner to highlighting the good emotions that we may have. So that way, if AI is able to help us through very difficult, complex emotions like grief, but also to be able to make what's happy, happier. That seems to be the best, most rosy future that we may be able to look forward to.
Awesome, thank you. And Sara, what's the best way for us to find out about you?
Sorry about that. So Future Privacy Forum, you can find us at fpf.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. I will give my vision, because as moderator, I'm also allowed. I focus a lot on mental health in my personal work for the past number of years. Also, currently with IEEE, I focus a lot on well-being, both physiological and just in general. But then just me as John, I like picturing, like you just said, Sarah, that emotional training becomes kind of a norm. Maybe it's because I'm a 51-year-old guy in America, but being trained in emotions wasn't really something that happened when I was growing up, unless it was like a Clint Eastwood movie and the training was don't have any. That didn't really help. And I also think the opportunity right now for the caregiving that we're seeing such an amazing outpouring of, and the vital need where right now I think most people are keenly aware of how much care is so needed. And I desperately hope that we don't go to kind of a back to status quo. And I'm speaking again largely of the States, the US, of this sense of how can we always be thinking who could maybe use my help. And again, this is my vision. I've written about this. I love the idea that maybe you'd be in a room and where people give permission and the disclosure settings are according to how they want this. The data is all taken care of. The bias is taken care of. So all the things we've touched on here, there could still be a setting that sort of says, like in augmented reality, I could use someone to talk to. And there could be sort of like a dating app for purpose, where you could be connected with someone and through gratitude and positive psychology, altruism, compassion, you helping them would help you both. And this sort of like combined way to use these amazing technologies. And then also when the technology could say like, hey, you seem like you're doing okay here. You don't need the emotional wingman. Why don't you turn me off? So that level of knowledge using the amazing technologies to really help increase human well-being. And again, that's John's personal thought. That's not a formal whatever. That said, I can be found ethicsinAction.ieee.org. And it's actually 3 words, ethics in action, not ethics in action, because that would be a pretty silly site. And we'd love to have you involved in what we do. IEEE is a nonprofit, all volunteer driven. And lastly, I just want to say a huge thank you to Seth. And I know there's some other great content, I believe, wrapping up the rest of the event. Seth, I don't know if you want to add any final words and just say thank you again to all the panelists for all these great insights, and Seth for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much, John, and panelists for participating today. I've put your names back on the screen and affiliations. It was great to have you participate. I will say I do tend to be more of a dystopian myself. I think about the kind of use case that slips through the GDPR and the HIPAA compliance net. For instance, one of the primary use cases for facial coding for emotion recognition right now is in-vehicle, in-cabin experience for drivers. If you're using a system that you're essentially licensing, not buying, but licensing, because that's where we're moving for complex software systems. And what is a car but a software platform? That's where we're moving. You're using a car from Audi that has cameras trained on you, and you don't get a GDPR compliant terms of service for that. And Audi has made a deal, or whoever's licensing the car to you, where your those pictures, that video is going to be shared with your insurance company. And they're going to say, hey, that John, he is one angry driver. Well, that's, as I said, I'm a bit of a dystopian there. So thank you very much for participating.